Hey everybody, this is Bob Goodwin, president of Career Club, and welcome to another episode of Career Club Live. I am especially excited about today's episode. We are having a conversation with Peter Cappelli, one of the foremost thought leaders in human resources, talent management, and organizational behavior. Peter is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and the director of Wharton's Center for Human Resources, where he spent decades researching how organizations attract, develop, and retain talent. In today's discussion, we're going to explore how financial incentives actually distort HR decisions, often leading to an underinvestment in talent, why companies consistently underestimate the true cost of turnover and disengagement, and the shift from cost-cutting to workforce agility, and what leaders need to do differently in 2025. And with that, Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome. How are you doing today? I hope.
Good, I'm well, and you can tell this is a real office behind me. Nobody would have a screensaver that's this messy, so this is the real.
I think it's the brilliant professor look, and you wear it well. So real quick, just as is our want to do before we dive into our topic, and I am very excited to get into this, is as our want is to just learn a little bit about you as a human being first. So where was Peter Cappelli born and raised? Where'd you grow up?
Upstate New York, in Utica, New York, where my grandfather had moved in 1910 or something like that. You may know this, but there were no passports before World War I.
I did.
And people went back and forth a lot. So apparently I had a great-grandfather who was here, and my grandfather was here, but my father was born in Italy because they went back and forth, which I also discovered does not help you in getting Italian citizenship, in case you were curious.
That's disappointing, and I'm sorry to hear.
Yeah.
See, that's what I love about asking these questions. You learn fascinating things. And just a little bit about your family.
Well, I'm the baby of the extended family, so you can tell we're losing people. We have turnover at the top of our family. My mother was, my father was obviously Italian. My mother was born in Alabama, and my parents.
Mine too.
My parents were World War II, met in World War II. My mother was at the USO in Alabama. My father was a lawyer, but he was sent to do exercise instructions at Fort McClellan in Alabama. Good selection decision there on the part of the Army. My mother joined the Army, infuriated my father because she ultimately, I think, became a captain, and he was stuck as a corporal or so they weren't supposed to fraternize, but they did, and here I am.
And we're thankful that they did. Is your mother a native? Was she a native Alabamian?
Yeah. Fought in the Civil War, that side of the family. On the other side of the Civil War, we might say.
Yeah, no, I am. My wife calls me a half-breed because my dad was from New York and my mother was from Alabama.
Well, exactly.
My wife is a Southerner all the way. So
is mine. Are we married to the same person? Are we married to the same person? Where's your wife from?
Florida, Central Florida.
Mine's from Memphis. So.
Ooh, there you go. Awesome. We can talk Tennessee, but that's a different topic. And then very quickly, Peter, what do we find you doing when you're not writing amazing books and doing awesome research?
Yard work, basically. Yesterday, I was on my tractor pulling down some dead trees, and I enjoy doing that stuff because, when you're done, you can see what you did, and no one comes along and said, you should have pulled that down differently, or you should have chosen a different tree, stuff we get as academics, right? Don't get any of that.
Strong back, weak mind. I love it. Now, yard work is very satisfying. You're outside, first of all. Yeah. And like you said, you can see what you did. Like, hey, that used to be there. It's not there anymore. I did a good job today.
Yeah, right.
So I enjoy that. All right. You have captured my imagination because you have done some really important research that is actually helping us understand how to bridge the gap between human resources and how it actually impacts the business. And one of the first things that you shared with me was actually an accounting, I don't know if anomaly is the right word, but the difference between the US accounts for human capital and how it's done in other parts of the world, particularly Europe. So can you talk just a little bit how financial accounting is distorting how we make human capital decisions?
Sure. So I think first, maybe to start, we think about our accounting system, and particularly the general accepted accounting practices, GAAP stuff, was created at a point in time when manufacturing was the big deal and physical assets were what we talked about, right? That was everything. The huge manufacturing companies, which drove our thinking. And as a result, to make GAAP kind of internally all make sense, there were some rules laid down. And one of them is about what is an asset. And assets are important because they offset liabilities. If you got a lot of them, company's more valuable, et cetera. So you want to be clear about what those are. And they wanted to make clear that it was something you owned. So in order to be an asset, you had to own it. You couldn't just be borrowing it, or it couldn't belong to a friend, or,
Right.
Now that means that employees can't be assets because you don't own them. So even if they are under contract to you, they can't be assets. So if you think about professional sports, for example, a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, who won the Super Bowl this year.
I heard about that.
Did you? Yeah. And you look at that team, and is it valuable? You would think, wow, super valuable, right? And then you say, well, what do they own, the Eagles? So, well, they got training facilities and stuff like that. But we got all these players under contract. And the answer from financial accounting is, well, you don't own any of those players, do you? Yeah, but they're under contract. Doesn't matter. No value to the players. Right? So if you start thinking about why that matters, then a bunch of other things start to become clear as well. For example, if you had a piece of capital equipment and you were spending money to maintain it, that is an investment. If you upgrade it, it's an investment. If you have an employee who you are sending to keep their skills up to date and spending money on training, not an investment, because you don't own the employees, so training can't be an investment. If you're thinking about a piece of capital equipment, when you buy it, you can depreciate it, which means you can pay it off slowly because it's an asset. If it's an employee who you've acquired, and let's say you paid him a big signing bonus, you can't pay that off over time. You got to pay that off the first year, right? When you've incurred the expense. Depreciation also reminds you that the assets are getting worn out, physical assets, right? Time to do something to upgrade them or replace them, reserve some money for that. With employees, no, none of that stuff, right? So, I think that's the place to start, is that if you think about contemporary companies, capital assets are pretty modest in most of them. You think about the big tech companies and the most valuable ones, right? Which, except for NVIDIA and some chip companies right now, they're all companies, or mainly companies other than Apple, that don't make stuff. It's intellectual capital and talent. But those companies appear to have no value, right? So it seems weird. And here's why this starts to matter now. This has always been true. One reason is those companies, the human capital intensive ones, are now much more important and much more prominent. And also, financial accounting has become more important. Why is that? Financial accounting is what investors see. That is what gets reported by publicly held companies. Even privately held companies follow all the same practices and typically report to banks in much the same way. And so as investors become more important, financial accounting becomes more important. And every year since, the shareholder value kind of revolution in the early 80s, which was entirely an intellectual exercise. No law was passed, no regulation was passed. It was just the argument, really, that started in academic circles, that companies should be run for the benefit of shareholders. They were the stakeholder that mattered. And you don't see that everywhere, and you didn't see it before, but that's the story now. As that becomes more important, then whatever appears in financial accounting becomes more important as well. That's kind of the rules of the game to decide who's winning, is financial accounting.
That's right.
And it is aggregated up from cost accounting inside a company that tells you, what are we spending on each little thing, and what are all our sources of revenue. Those all get aggregated up to a small number, relatively, of categories, and that's where financial accounting is. There's some other quirks as well about financial accounting and reporting arrangements. And one of them is that important reports are on a per employee basis. What's your revenue per employee? What's your profit per employee, right? It doesn't say per worker. And one of the things that's changed now is that you could have lots of people working for you who are not employees.
That's right.
So I could take my head count of employees and drive it down and replace those people with contractors or with leased employees who were under contract to somebody else. My head count has dropped, and suddenly my performance per employee shoots way up because I've cut the denominator, right?
Yep.
So one of the reasons why companies are, aggressive about cutting headcount is it's not about cutting costs. It's not per se, because replacing employees with lease workers on a per hour basis way more expensive. Now, the conceit here was to say, well, but it's more flexible. It's not really more flexible. You got a contract.
That's right.
With a leasing company. You got a contract with contractors. Employment is, moderately, at least, at will in lots of places. And we don't seem to have much trouble laying people off these days.
We're going to get to that in a minute.
So, this is a quirky thing about reporting, which encourages companies to replace regular employees with non-employee workers.
So let's go back to the financial accounting bit for a second, because if I follow, the implication is that we could invest $1 million in training and developing our people this year, and that if the lifespan of that training is 5 years, I could amortize $200,000 a year over 5 years and not take a giant hit to my profitability, because I didn't have to take the $1 million all in one big lump. Right. But that isn't how we do it in the U.S. It's like, no, sorry, you do need to take that $1 million all in the year that it was incurred. Yep. And all of the things being equal, my commodity costs are going up, borrowing costs are going up. I've got all kinds of things that are happening that are negatively impacting my profitability. Yep. No, we're not going to train our folks, at least not to that extent this year, because it's just going to be a drag on earnings. Am I tracking with you?
Yep, that's right. And I think another thing about that is that if you look at other countries, it's not, they don't all do things the same way, but on some dimensions with professional sports, for example, they do allow companies to account for that value of having players under contract. So you could do it, you could do that.
My Liverpool Football Club can actually amortize their players.
Yeah, they can, right. They can treat them more like real assets, right? And on training, the other part about that one is that you might say, well, training is a good thing and investors ought to care about that. And they do. The problem is in financial accounting, you can't find those numbers anywhere. They're aggregated up into a bigger category of operating and administrative expenses, which are things like the coffee expenses and things that just look like you're running your offices expensively, right? So you can't find it if you were an employer. Now, the other thing you might reasonably say is, yeah, but wouldn't you as an employer want to tell investors that? Yes. And you might say the answer is yes, but in practice, they don't want to tell investors anything that they don't have to tell them. And the answer you get back as to why is, well, if we tell them, they want to see that number every year. Mm-hmm. And even when it's bad and we don't want to show it to them. And then they ask all kinds of related questions that might be harder for us to answer. So even though it might make sense in some ways to show them that number, they don't want to do it. And their employers resist it.
So Peter, I want to move on in a second, but what's going on in the world of, financial accounting, because if the system was geared towards 100+ years ago or whatever,
Yep.
and clearly we've moved past that, aren't people going like, wait, this isn't, I want to be able to amortize these kinds of expenses. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, so there's one story of resistance, and there's a possible story about change. But financial accounting and all accounting, general accepted accounting practices, are created and administered by the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And this is a private organization that is accountable to itself largely, which is accountable to the accounting profession and the financial world as well. I think it's probably fair to say that they see their mission as maintaining the integrity of GAAP. And my colleagues who are closer to this than I am say they've always resisted efforts at change. They see that as defeating the purpose of GAAP, so they're resisting any change. The investors have been pushing for change because they want to see this stuff. And there's a proposal right now in front of the Security Exchange Commission to make companies, report training expenses, turnover numbers, what they're doing with respect to careers, and total labor spend as opposed to just employee headcount.
Yes.
And we'll see where that one goes. A couple of years ago, this kind of pressure led the Security Exchange Commission, which sits above GAAP and the private Financial Accounting Standards Board, but they allow FASB and GAAP to be the law, the rule of the land, but ultimately they're in charge, the SEC. So investors press them to require companies to report information on human capital. So what the rule ended up asking requiring companies to do is to report anything that they themselves felt was material to their business, so that it really matters, around human capital. So what do you get in terms of reports? I mean, my read of this is you get like nothing useful. Mainly it used to be companies reporting about their DEI priorities and things like this. I imagine this year it'll be about companies reporting that DEI is not a priority this year, but it's mainly qualitative stuff. They weren't reporting numbers or, real stuff. I mean, it was just a waste of time. And if you think about it, the whole point of accounting is that you want everybody to report the same stuff by the same definition. Otherwise, it's not very useful. And so allowing every company to report whatever it wants by whatever criteria it wants ends up not being very useful.
No, that, as you say, that's very qualitative. We'll move on, but it just seems it's a little stunning to me that the investment world hasn't been able to move the needle because, you want it fair, you want it consistent, but you want it accurate. And you've created the system is creating something that is actually like a wet blanket on making better decisions. It's not even like, hey, but everybody's off by the same amount because we're all kind of treated this way. It's actually leading to not good outcomes in terms of how they're investing in their own business and their people. That part to me is like kind of FASB tradition be damned. Like I need a better system that reflects how I'm running my business and want to run my business.
Right. No, I think that's right. And the two blocks on the other side are FASB and GAAP, and also the companies who are aligned in not wanting to do anything different. And so it's going to be a political decision that somebody has to make about who you're going to listen to, the investors or FASB and the companies. And I mean, that's an interesting battle,
That is an interesting. Well, stay tuned for that one. You'll be on another episode when we're in round 3 of that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you have done a lot of work on, and this is very apropos to the times that we're in right now, is the misunderstood cost of turnover. I read a very interesting article in Business Insider last week. Your colleague Adam Grant had done some work on this too, where kind of this low performers purge that is in vogue right now, right? And, Facebook, has put a scarlet letter on all these people that they've decided are low performers.
Yeah.
And it kind of harkens back to GE, was it rank-and-yank?
Yep. Yep.
Could you talk about that a little bit? Because again, it's an easy move to make, and maybe it's the other dark shadow of the accounting thing. But hey, great, I get to yank out $1 million of costs, and we're all good, right? And the stock market's happy for an hour. But that's not really how it plays out. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, so there are two issues there. So let's talk about both of them. One is layoffs per se and turnover, and then the other is this rank-and-yank approach, which was invented by the U.S. Army in the Second World War. And the idea was they suddenly needed, when the war began, really expand the Army. And that meant they had to expand the officer corps quickly. How to do that? So they asked the most senior or most junior officers to say, to rank the employees or do a performance appraisals really on the regular enlisted men. And they discovered, this won't shock anybody, that they didn't vary that much and they weren't all that useful. So then they switched it and just said, okay, rank them for us. And it's a whole lot easier to rank people or anything than it is to say, how much better is this one than that one? If you just have to say who's number one, number two, number three. And then they discovered that actually predicted pretty well who was going to be succeeding as a junior officer. So that's where it comes from. It's been around a long time. GE had this idea that they added something to it, and that was the assumption that if you were a poor performer, it was because of you, not the circumstances around you, not the way you were supervised. This is known in psychology and elsewhere as the fundamental attribution error. And this is the assumption that the way you behave is because who you are as a person dispositionally. Mm-hmm. And that was Jack Welch's belief. And so he said, if you have poor performers, just fire them. So they were firing the bottom 10% every year. Now, what the company knew in the HR side was that the people they were hiring in to replace these people didn't turn out any better than the people they had let go. And this is another way of saying that the reason people perform poorly in a given year got nothing to do with who they are. They could be having a bad year. They could be having a bad manager. They could be given a problem that was just too hard to solve. So we did a study on this, but there are others as well who've known this for a long time, looking at the performance appraisal scores of people in a Fortune 500 company this year, next year, the year after that, for about 7 or 8 years or so. And the question I asked was, how well could we predict next year's performance appraisal score for you if we know this year's score? So if it was literally true that it was entirely dispositional, we could predict 100%. If it was random, we predict 0, right? And if you ask people how much does it predict, they would say they typically guess like 80%. Yeah. But the answer was closer to 20%. It's a whole lot closer to random than it was to being predictive. Now, the GE guys had to wait until Jack Welch left, but the next year they dumped the rank-and-yank model because they knew it didn't work. But he was such a believer in this, you couldn't tell him otherwise. So they got rid of it, right? So that model is a model which empirically just does not work very well. I think what happens in that model is it's kind of a reflection now of the fact that companies don't manage performance very well. They don't pay much attention to it. So they probably have people who are performing poorly and they don't do anything about them. And then they periodically now have a layoff. And then they have a reason where from the top down, they can make them fire the worst performers in their sense. So that's part of what's going on. But even there, I think that the complication is, unless you've done a good job managing performance and you really know how well people have performed year by year by year, you end up going with your gut at the end of the year and dismissing those people. And one of the things we know pretty well is going with your gut really just means going with your biases. So it's a really bad idea, And then we get to the issue of layoffs. Do they improve financial performance? And the evidence, we've been looking at this question for a long time, a lot of studies on this. hard to find any that show that it improves performance. And the most recent studies that I've seen indicate that the longer you can wait in a downturn to lay off people, particularly the last Great Recession, the better your longer term performance is going to be. And the reason is because if the economy is going to go down, it's going to go back up at some point. And as we saw after the pandemic, it goes up and you don't have the people to do the work. You are really caught flat-footed, and your employees, your competitors who have employees still around, boom, they take off, and they really end up trouncing you, right?
Yeah.
So the evidence that it helps you is really, really not there, and largely ideological, just a belief that it must help.
Well, gosh, I just want to pick up on a couple of points. I mean, one is, we talk a lot about people hire people. Well, what I just heard you say is people fire people.
Yeah.
And, like Peter's kind of a pain in the ass anyway. And,
Right.
and like, we don't, sure, Peter's on the list. And sorry, Bob is the pain in the butt. But I mean, one is just those biases, and then we try and rationalize them, right, in a way that kind of keeps our ego intact, and somehow we can justify what we've done. It's interesting to me, though, that the study you were just referencing about the longer that you can hold on, because I can just massively see being in some meeting or seminar or something and say, the sooner that you act on this, the mistake is people wait too long, right? You're saying actually it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because you often hear executives say that I never felt I waited too long to fire somebody. But the reality, I think, is they waited too long to do anything about poor performance. And that could very well be true. But at that point, they just decide to fire people. So they haven't done anything to try to figure out what the problem is or improve the employee. They just fire them. So if you said we waited too long to deal with performance issues, that could very well be true. But what they should have done is something other than the first thing to fire people. But that is kind of this fundamental attribution error problem. We just got the wrong guy in the.
Well, let's weave a couple ideas together then. I mean, one is we're not investing in people the way that we should, because if for no other reason, there are perverse incentives provided by the accounting system. Secondly, let's get into a layoff situation. So we haven't trained the people as well as we could or should. Now we're going to let go of people, probably for some not great reasons. So we've got, now people have a bigger span of control.
Yes.
Right. So now I'm actually able to tend to the people in my flock less well, because having 10 people report to me is different than having 18 people report to me. Mm-hmm. And so then, people are just sort of left out there dangling even more on the end of the limb, and they're going to be next year's low performers.
Yes.
And you have this really negative curve that develops. Is that right?
No, that sounds right. I hadn't thought about the negative curve thing, but that's probably true. You may know this story about Microsoft in its down period there, maybe 15 years ago or so, where they had forced ranking systems. And the story one heard from inside is that it was extremely difficult to get people to move in the company, even when they were needed, because I know if I move to this new team, there's a very good chance I'm going to be the worst performer for a while, and then I could get fired. Mm-hmm. So nobody wants to move, right? So I think that is an important point. One of the things we have vastly underplayed is the importance of experience. We now seem to be fixated instead on the idea that we could just get new people, new blood in, and this will really help. But the evidence is quite persuasive otherwise. So my colleague, Matthew Bidwell here, did a study, very intuitive, easy to understand, a few years ago, where he looked at people who were promoted into a position. These were director level jobs across a bunch of financial institutions, and compared them to people who were hired from the outside into the same job. Okay. Yeah. And found that the people who were hired from the outside, it took them 3 years to perform as well as those people who had been promoted into those roles. And a lot of that is just insider knowledge and understanding the place works. It wasn't that they were dumb. The other thing he found is the people who were promoted from within, it took them 7 years to catch up to the pay of the people hired from the outside.
Oh, wow.
So when we're hiring from the outside, It's a smart thing to do. Well, you're taking a hit on performance and you're taking a hit on pay that goes on for a long time. The other thing is you're going to take a hit on turnover, because one of the sure ways you can drive turnover is don't promote people. There's this amazing statistic from ADP, the payroll processing place, which follows 80 million employees or something like that.
Wow.
And they found that the typical person who is promoted, of those people who are promoted, 29% of them quit within the next month, I think. Maybe it was 2 months. So we just promote these people and 30% of them are gone in a month or 2 months. Why is that? Doesn't that sound like a terrible thing? Well, the reason seems to be, at least in part, is this phenomenon of dry promotions. And if you've ever heard that. So that means we give you a promotion, but we don't raise your pay yet. We'll get to you next year. The problem is...
This is a great opportunity for you, Peter. This is a great opportunity for you.
Yes, that's what they'll tell us, right? And the opportunity is you've suddenly made me a lot more valuable on the outside labor market, because now I've got a higher job title, and you've increased the extent to which I'm underpaid in my current organization. Why is it a surprise that I'm quitting? Well, somebody thinks this is a money saver, right? And what they're not, of course, understanding is how expensive it is to lose anybody, but also your best performers. You just promoted these people and you're disproportionately losing them. Who could possibly think this is a good idea? Well, people who don't understand any of this stuff.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you is, like, some of these are like not new insights. Like, this is known.
Right. That's right.
But we keep kind of just doing Groundhog Day of repeating mistakes and making bad decisions.
Yep.
That the body of evidence, empirical, quantified, validated evidence,
Yep.
would clearly indicate that's not the right decision to make.
Yep.
Why do we keep doing the same thing over and over again?
Yeah, no, that is a really important story. And I think that's been kind of neglected. You know, the reason I started looking into this financial accounting stuff was to try to answer that question. Why are we managing people badly and worse than we did a generation ago? We don't train, we don't hire people carefully, you know, just on most every dimension. Why do we not do that? So I spoke to a group of CFOs last year, actually 3 different groups of CFOs, and they were unaware of all this stuff. And they were, to my surprise, they were remarkably open and interested in hearing how much turnover costs, right? How much more valuable the better employees are, all this stuff. They just had no idea. And in fairness to them, it's not their job, right? Their job is to pay attention to the investor perspective and to think about the finance aspects of the business per se. So why is it that they don't know this stuff? And, you know, some of this has to do with a failing in the human resource side. So, you know, the number that HR people need to like wear on their shirt is turnover costs, right? So if you're an executive and you think that the turnover costs are $4,000 a year, which is what you hear a lot, and the reason is that was an estimate created of the administrative expenses associated with bringing a new person into the organization. Not getting them.
They say the interview process, the recruiting and interviewing.
That stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
That's all. Not getting them up to speed, not making them productive, but just getting them in the door.
And how about all the lost productivity from the person that's not in the job today?
Great. And here's one that I was surprised to learn. A couple of my labor economics colleagues did an interesting study of turnover, even in sort of hourly employees. And they saw the biggest cost of turnover was actually in the time sunk by your peers in the hiring process to replace you. So candidates come in and you have to meet with them and you have to show them around and all this sort of stuff, which is something we never would have thought, right? Well, if you're an executive and you think the turnover costs are $4,000, you don't care much about them. If you think it's $40,000, you start paying attention. If you think it's $100,000, you know, there's a red light flashing. And so part of the problem is they don't know that. And this is partly an HR problem. HR folks have been reluctant to try to calculate that number. Sometimes they'll tell you, we don't know how to do it. And what I tell them is, nobody has a perfect answer to anything in business. Give them your best guess. There are calculators online you can find. They'll tell you how to do this. There's a bunch of academic studies that'll tell you what to count and things. It's not that hard to do. And I always tell them, look at your marketing colleagues. They're going with their best guess all the time. And we're worried, oh my God, I can't do this perfectly, so I'm not even going to guess.
Yeah, but if we were at a cocktail party or I'm sitting next to you on the airplane, I'm like, but just, Peter, kind of generally speaking, it's $100,000 a year job. What's the turnover cost based on that?
I would say $100,000, but it depends on the job. And if you're taking somebody out of a professional service firm, the estimate is it's 5 times that. Right? If you're taking somebody out of a team, if you're taking a scrub nurse out of a surgical team, for example, it's probably double, triple in terms of the consequences of disrupting that team dynamic, So in some jobs, it could be hugely more than others. But even having a general number that's more accurate would help an awful lot. And, you can't blame the people at the top for thinking this stuff just doesn't matter very much. With respect to layoffs, the view is, and you saw this during COVID, right? Well, we'll cut people, but then we'll rehire them when we need them.
Yes.
Guess what? Everybody needed them at the same time. And it's hard sometimes to remember how many companies struggled just to keep going because they didn't have enough bodies.
Well, don't you remember all the restaurants? Like they're paying huge bonuses and everything. Just please, we need at least 3 people to help open a Taco Bell today.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things we didn't understand at the time was, the perception was, well, these people are just lazy. They're sitting around because they're getting COVID payments. And it turned out the evidence was that wasn't true. You could see what happens when the payments ended. It didn't change very much. It was more likely to be the case, we weren't paying attention, that Amazon, UPS, and these other remote-based companies were hiring like mad. Yeah. And they were paying starting at $20 an hour and $25 an hour, and you're trying to hire people at minimum wage and you can't do it. Well, this is not a market problem. This is just you're not paying attention to where the labor market went. It's not that we suddenly had lazy people.
So I want to pick up on a point that you made that I hadn't really thought of before. You made many that I haven't thought of before, but one that sticks in my mind is, wearing that number on their chest of turnover costs. Put it on your shirt. Because, one of my objectives, even with this podcast that we're doing right now, is to help HR professionals, make the business case internally, but to speak the language of the CEO and the CFO. I think I shared with you in a separate conversation. I looked at 2 years worth of news feeds of what goes directed to CHROs and what goes directed to CEOs and CFOs. And the overlap was pretty much
zero.
Not. Yes. And just
yeah.
But I mean, they're literally speaking 2 different languages.
Yeah.
And it's okay. Yeah. And so I've kind of been, hey, come on, HR professionals, you guys need to learn how to speak the language of the CEO and the CFO.
Yeah.
But kind of with a little bit of a light bulb that went off is hey, an HR professional, there's a net good you can be doing to your executive colleagues. If you guys don't understand some of these numbers, let me help you understand something, right? And I think that that's just such an important point. And as you say, there's a rich body of evidence out there to draw on. Yep. This sounds dumb, but it kind of doesn't matter which number you use. It's a hell of a lot more than 4,000.
Yeah.
Right. That should be enough to get somebody's attention of times, 2,000 employees, this is a problem.
Yeah. And I think particularly the CEO is the audience. I mean, the CFO is focused on financial accounting numbers for a good reason. But the CEO is interested in all the costs because it's going to affect the business. Even if it doesn't show up on this year's balance sheet, it's affecting the business. That money is coming from someplace and going someplace out the door, right? So that's the audience. And I think what we don't want HR people to do, and I'm afraid we encourage them to waste time with this, they don't have to be the strategy person, Mm-hmm. We don't have to, to discuss marketing strategy and all this sort of stuff at the operating committee. You don't have to do that, but you have to be able to speak about your own problems in HR in a way that the other functions understand, and that is the language of finance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that you have to figure out, what's our internal rate of return and for the company and what should it be, but you do have to tell them, here's what we are seeing in the human capital side, because human capital, by the way, is like all we got now. And here's what we're seeing in terms of the value of a better employee. Here's what we're seeing it costs us if somebody quits. Here's how much we are losing when we leave a position vacant, which is, those are three big things where the top executives have assumptions which are completely wrong, right? Don't think it costs much to leave a position vacant. Don't think turnover costs very much. Don't really have any idea how much more valuable somebody who is really good is and hard to replace as opposed to somebody who is average.
Hi, I'm Stephen Rothberg.
And I'm Jeanette Leeds.
And together, we're the co-hosts of the High Volume Hiring Podcast.
Are you involved in hiring dozens or even hundreds of employees a year? If so, you know that the typical sourcing tools, tactics, and strategies, they just don't scale.
Yeah. Our bi-weekly podcast features news, tips, case studies, and interviews with the world's leading experts about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to high volume hiring.
Make sure to subscribe today.
Yeah. Okay. So that's awesome. So as we try and kind of help HR leaders, be able to speak that language of the CEO, let's just sort of, I want to make sure that I'm even starting from the right premise here. Is it your observation that HR leaders do tend to struggle to speak the language of the CEO?
I think they're not really trying to do it. And I think we thought for a while that it was important for them to understand enough finance to do that. They don't even need to understand a single thing about finance. All they need to be able to do is total up the costs, right? And you don't have to put it in terms of ROIs. You don't have to put it in terms of whether it beats your internal rate of return, any of that stuff. You just have to say, here's the dollar costs when somebody walks out the door. Here's the lost productivity. It's really cost accounting has got nothing to do with fancy finance stuff. Just total up those numbers. That's all. Because they never see them. The top executives never see those numbers. They have no idea that it costs you a lot to replace somebody because it takes years sometimes for them to figure out how the place works as well as your current employees do.
Did you publish a number, Peter, that said something like roles are getting filled by only like 5% or 10% of promotions, and because it's going back to your point about sort of the allure of the outside recruit. Is that, am I directionally correct?
Yeah,
on
there's
that?
a lot of estimates of that, and SHRM has one. And the way you can get that number for your own company is look at your applicant tracking software. Most big companies use that. And it just tells you where did the people come from who filled our positions and what percentage of those are internal. And the last SHRM number I saw said it was less than 20% internal.
Yeah.
And that seems like, 20%, except that if you went back to the 1980s, it would be 90%. So
Really?
we went from 90% to the early 80s to 20%. And that is astonishing. And it's not just at entry-level jobs. There is nothing really that looks like entry-level jobs much anymore. We're now filling positions all the way up and down from outside, more at the lower levels than at the top executive levels. But even at the top executive levels, we're going outside. So hiring, dominates all our attention. If you think about the change in terminology from human resources, and then maybe 20 years ago or so, it was talent management. Talent management was about filling positions, internal training and development, and hiring. And now it's all talent acquisition is all you hear, which is just hiring. Not even training, not even development, just hiring. That's all we do is hire. And that's crazy, right? I mean, that is just crazy.
Well, and when the average tenure, I think right now is like 3.5 years or whatever it is these days, right? So where you have this hamster wheel that's just sort of churning, and we're just sort of churning through talent. We're in this constant replenishment
mode.
Right.
And if you think about it, as an employer, you should have a pretty good idea of who your best employees are. You should have a better idea than some employer on the outside who's looking in and trying to decide whether to hire your people or not. So that means we got to do more for our better employees. And that means promoting more people internally rather than trying to fill these positions from the outside. Why is that important? Because it's cheaper, and it reduces the turnover of your better people. But the problem is that requires some effort from the people at the top. And the effort has to be things like, we got to spend some money training people, and we've got to spend some money or time on development. That means their supervisors have to have some time to spend talking to them. We have to make that a priority. We have to have more opportunities internally for stretch assignments and developmental assignments. These things, don't cost money in the way the CFO would be worried about it, but they do take time and attention away from managers and leaders. So the question is, you're going to do that or not? The line managers are going to push back and rightly say, we're super busy, but somebody's got to tell them, this is saving us money. This is building our human capital. This company, it's all about human capital, right? And unless people at the very top are willing to say that and make that happen, you're going to be stuck, as you say, on this little hamster wheel of losing your best people because they're more valuable outside. So out they go. And you're left constantly spinning the wheel, hoping for new talent. Right?
Becoming a magnet for mediocrity. Like that doesn't sound like a winning proposition.
Yeah. Watching the NBA these days, and I'm thinking that too.
Oh gosh. Oh my God. So I was reading something recently. I'd like to get your take on this. You mentioned professional services earlier. And, many companies, not professional services, many companies are oriented around functional, departmental kinds of roles. And I'm in marketing, or I'm in sales, or I'm in whatever. And the needs of the business change. And it's like, well, I guess we don't need those anymore. And we just send them away. And professional services doesn't really roll like that. If you're like McKinsey, just as an example, or even accounting firms, is like they're more project oriented.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're working on this project right now. It's got a beginning, middle, and an end. That project is over. And now I'm going to redeploy you into this new thing. Does that resonate with you? And if so, could you talk about it?
Yeah. So I think, if we had turned back the clock more than 20 years ago, 30, 40, 50 years before, professional services were not seen as particularly sophisticated organizations, especially in terms of human capital stuff. It was the big corporations who were really pretty fancy in the things they were doing. AT&T had a management development program with 75,000 participants in it.
Wow.
Unbelievable scale of the things we were doing. But now the professional service firms are more sophisticated than the corporations, at least in my view. They take talent more seriously. They figured out how to develop people without a lot of expensive classroom-based training. It's an apprentice model. You're learning by doing,
Yes.
And so I think they are now better at it. They're also more flexible. Now, here's and maybe the most interesting development in human resources, I think, are these talent marketplaces. Talent marketplaces grew out of the internal job bidding and posting systems, which got started after Monster.com in 1999 started pulling everybody out of these companies because it was easier to find a job than it was to find one in your own company.
Yes. Because
in your own company, everything was locked up in these old job ladders and you had to wait your turn and, all that stuff. So those worked quite well, these internal labor markets, bidding and posting systems. And there's pretty good evidence at the time that they cut turnover rates in half when you put them in place. But then we started to squeeze them. And what happened was when they first started, your manager was not typically allowed to even know that you wanted to move. Why not? Because if you knew, then you might try to hold me. And more importantly, for me, if I'm a candidate, if I have to tell you that I want to move away from you, and then I don't get the job someplace else, and I got to come back to you, and think of this as like dating at the prom,
You read my mind. That's exactly what I tried to get a better date. I couldn't. Can we still go to the prom?
Yeah, right. How do you feel? How do you like me now? It's not going to be quite so nice, right? So that's why they did it. But then after the Great Recession, when people were not quitting so much, the line managers began, I think, to push back. And they didn't like the churn. So we didn't want Bob to leave. Look, we just got him here and he's really good. I want to keep him. And they would find ways to hold you or sabotage you or whatever. And the requirements shifted, and now you needed your boss's permission, or at the very least, your boss had to know that you were trying to leave your boss. And that clogs up the system. So a simple thing to do is we got to go back to open that up a little more. But the talent marketplaces have added on to that and said, you could apply to work on a project. You keep your regular job, but you can work on this project for 6 weeks or something like that. You could be a temp over here or part-time over here in our company, all in the same place. Interestingly, the federal government started to do this quite some time ago. We think of them as, of course, being rigid and stuff now, but they were quite flexible. And those are all ways to help develop employees internally, and they cost you nothing, right? I mean, almost nothing, right? I spend a little time over here. I learn what finance is about, and then maybe I decide whether I want to move in that direction, but stay in the company,
Right.
So talent marketplaces are a way to try to make regular companies more like the professional service firms that you're describing in the ability to flex and reconvene internally, right? They're really smart thing to do.
Very, very cool. Okay, there's a point that I absolutely do not want to make sure that I miss,
Okay.
which is, we talked about the cost of turnover, and you're like, Bob, don't worry about finance, don't worry about all this stuff, just stack the costs, right? What other, in your experience, your research, what is the lowest hanging fruit that a CHRO can go identify in their company to be able to help the CEO make the best decisions?
I think what we're trying to do overall is to try to make them understand why some resources devoted to human resources and employees matter, because I think at the moment they don't think they do. I'd say low-hanging fruit, because it's something they already believe, is how valuable are our best employees compared to our average employees. Frankly, because most executives believe they are the A players anyway. Maybe they were. So they're sympathetic to that view already. If you could just tell them that, and then you have a reason for saying, here's why it's important to invest in those people and why it's important to promote them internally, right? So I would say after turnover costs, that's a simple low-hanging fruit to grab. After that, what's an interesting one? I'd say I would start looking at exit interview data and why people quit. And that is usually something that you can do something about, or at least respond to. Are you trying to be penny wise and pound foolish? Like, we'll just hold our costs down here and we're saving money by, we're in the 30th percentile of the pay distribution. We're saving a lot of money. Well, not if you're losing lots of people out the door, so.
Yeah, the people that are okay with that probably aren't the people that you want.
Yeah, right. And I think trying to get some sense about how long people need to be in the company before you start seeing them be really productive. And I think what you find is that, they get more productive. I heard an incredible story years ago. Believe it or not, I used to take MBA students to the U.S. Steel manufacturing facility where they're making with blast furnaces. And there were guys in that, I think it was all men at the time, who were the chief steel makers. These guys wear asbestos suits. They come out, they put dynamite in a plug in the giant vat. They blow it out and the steel comes out at 1,000,000 degrees. I thought for sure we were going to see a headline that says entire MBA class lost in steel making incident, because we were standing above this on a catwalk full of graphite dust and stuff. Anyway, the interesting thing is that they had an early out retirement program, and the average age of their steel makers fell from 35 years of tenure to 25. And they said their steel making costs went up by 10%. And you might ask yourself, how much more could you learn about steel making after you've been there for 25 years? Well, apparently a lot, right? And they never would have known that until they saw those people leave, So that's the kind of stuff that I think resonates with people at the top already, and it is important for them to know. So
have you done research? Have you done research on because where you took my mind was ageism, and sort of this quest for the young employee who's smart, agile, tech savvy, whatever.
Yep.
And we don't want the old guy or the old lady. Is there any research to say actually here's why that's wrong?
Yeah, I wrote a book on that called Managing the Older Worker, and of course you're exactly
You're
right.
welcome.
You're exactly right. I didn't do this research, but there's a ton of research in gerontology, and basically everything gets better about older workers. Absenteeism is less, believe it or not. Turnover is actually less because they're not job hopping to go someplace else. Even healthcare costs were not as much greater as you would have thought because older workers don't have babies.
That's what
And they themselves get sick more, but they don't have children who need lots of healthcare and that stuff. So the only thing that gets worse on a cognitive dimension, their social skills are better, is solving novel problems under time pressure when you're not allowed to use, a calculator.
Oh.
The only time in adult life when you do that, as far as I can see, is taking SAT tests, right? So they're better on almost all dimensions. They don't expect very much, They're not looking for a lifetime career. They're quite flexible in terms of schedules and things like that. They've already got work ethics at this point in time, and yet employers discriminate against them extensively. And why is that? Well, the reason that I was looking at in particular is we now are much more likely to have younger supervisors trying to manage older subordinates. And they just find it difficult to do. I can't manage this guy because he looks like my dad. So I don't fire him. I think that's the new development, I think, that one. But a lot more people want to keep working.
Need to keep working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Another book on my list, but that's in the current job market. This is such an important dimension, and companies that are looking for great employees, and they're just sort of overlooking this amazing talent pool. So last question: if there's one major shift HR leaders should champion in 2025, what should it be?
Well, I would say in their own practices, I think these talent marketplaces are the thing to spend some time. But I think before that, it's all about conveying information to the leaders about real costs and real benefits, things that you can measure. And they don't have to be perfect. But, if you've got no direction now, it's just pointing them in the right direction. If you're off by an order of magnitude, it's better than nothing at all, which is what we got.
Here's my line on that: any candle in a cave.
Good point. Yeah.
20 watts is better than no watts. It's not 100 watts, but it's better than no watts.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Awesome. Peter, thank you so much. I could talk to you all afternoon, but I know you've got stuff to do. Very, very insightful. And I really do want to say thank you, because I think that you take things that I know are very rigorous from an analytics perspective and you make them very accessible. Good. Which I very much appreciate, and I know the audience appreciates as well. So with that, thank you so much. I know.